Good evening and welcome to A Slice of Life. I'm your host, Jim Therian. About 40 or 50 million years ago, there became a creature that would fly through the night eating loads and loads of insects. I'm talking about the bats that you see just towards the end of day flying through the forest against the setting sun. I have with me tonight a bat researcher from the Connecticut DEP. Her name is Dr. Devon Frazier, and she's here tonight to tell us about her research and about bats in general. Dr. Devon Frazier, welcome to A Slice of Life.
Thank you, Jim. It is wonderful to be here.
I'm very happy that you're here.
We're here to talk about my favorite topic.
Well, excellent. Now, before we get started about your bat research, I'd just like to hear about your resume, a verbal resume, and how you got from high school or college to here in little old Connecticut.
Sure. It's kind of a wandering tale, I suppose. I started, when I got to college, my first ambition was that I wanted to be a veterinarian because I wanted to work with animals, and that's just what I thought was the only avenue to get there. Luckily, I took a vertebrate zoology class, I think my third year in college, maybe my second. And I just got hooked. I realized that there was this whole world of wildlife research that was accessible, and so that's the path that I started following. Right after college, I went to South Africa and spent about 6 months on a game reserve, doing all sorts of cool research with amazing animals. I learned a lot of crucial skills like radio telemetry, which we can talk about maybe at some point. And then came back to the States, and that's where I just kind of went from one job to another as what's called a field technician or a research technician. And I got to work with all sorts of different species in all sorts of different places all over the country. And then it was in about, I think it was 2008, I got my first bat job in Kentucky. And I just fell in love. I got hooked, and that was it. I started grad school about 2 years after that at UCLA, where I received my doctorate. And mainly studied the effects of agricultural land use on bat foraging behavior and health. So.
No, it's interesting that you got hooked into bats because they're so mysterious. We seldom ever see them. Maybe for about 5 minutes a night as the sun sets, and then it's just too dark to see them. So fascinating that you picked bats.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the intrigue, especially as a scientist. We love to learn new things. And when you have this amazing, charismatic taxonomic group of animals, such as bats, you really have the opportunity to continuously learn. And bats are continuously surprising us, things that we didn't know before. We're still discovering new species of bats.
Wow.
So there's just still a lot to be learned because they are so cryptic and well hidden from us in our daily lives. We don't experience them. They're out at night when we can't really see them. They're generally foraging in areas where we're not present at night. So there's just so many opportunities to learn something.
I'll share this briefly with you. I was in the YCC way back in high school years, and we were overnight someplace, and one of my coworkers, we were standing in a field. It was the sun was setting, and she goes, "Jim, look out! There's bats behind you." And I thought, "You got to be kidding me! There's no bats." And I thought, "There's no bats in Connecticut. They're all down in Mexico, blood sucking and stuff." And I had no idea that we had a native population of bats, and so just fascinating.
Yeah, see, that's exactly what I mean. You can go basically your whole life up until you're in high school without even thinking about bats.
Right.
And then once you're aware that they're there, some people are scared of them, and I do understand the basis of that. Well, I understand the instinct to have that fear. Hopefully we can work on dispelling some of the myths that might lead to some of those fears.
Well, let's get started then.
Great.
So, Devon Frazier, Dr. Frazier, you're researching bats in Connecticut. What does that entail?
Yeah, so I am part of the Wildlife Diversity Program within the Wildlife Division at DEEP. And we are basically charged with the responsibility of monitoring, inventorying, and managing our wildlife species. The Wildlife Diversity Program specifically kind of is in charge of all the species that aren't covered by other programs, if that makes sense. So the New England Cottontail has its very own program and an amazing team of regional scientists and managers that are focusing on that issue. The fur bearers, like the things that we typically think of as harvested animals, they have their own program. And then the wildlife diversity kind of encompasses everything else, so
Everything
to
else,
speak.
right.
I'm the lead mammalogist for that program, which means I'm in charge of all of the mammals. However, since, let's see, what is it? 8 of the 11 species of mammals that are on the state endangered species list are bats. So the majority of my work really does focus on bats because they're kind
Wow.
of the most conservationally challenged right now.
Yeah. How do you get started in that? I was speaking to a fellow biologist for the state, Mr. Min Huang.
Oh yeah, Min.
And I was fascinated by how he took a forest plot and turned it into a laboratory with grid patterns, and I just thought, well, this is a fascinating. And do you do the same thing?
So my research is more, like I said, on inventorying and monitoring which species of bats occur where, what kind of habitat are they selecting for, and the best way that we have, or some of the tools that we use to get at that, is called acoustic monitoring. So we're basically eavesdropping on bats. And I
Right.
have an example here of what's called...
What's that you have there?
What is this? This is an acoustic detector. It's actually a microphone, and
Right.
it plugs in through USB to a computer that has a specialized software that is able to take these recordings as we pass. This mounts on the top of a vehicle.
Right.
We call this mobile acoustic surveys,
Right.
as opposed to passive, where you just put a unit out in some space or location and just leave it out overnight.
Like a trail cam or something.
Yeah, something that's more stationary. This is mobile, so we're actually moving along a road at a very slow pace, and this is recording every bat that it hears, and it's GPSing or geolocating that location as well, so we can go back and we can look on a map and say, this is where I picked up a big brown bat.
Hasn't the technology come pretty far?
The technology is getting better and better.
That's awesome.
Yes.
So you could drive by a big bat, and this system will say, alert, there's a big bat here, and then it'll get the GPS location.
Yeah, more or less. I have to go in later with a specialized software to say this was a big brown bat, but this
Right.
thing at least records it for me, so I can do that. I can go
Yeah,
back later
yeah,
and say,
yeah.
okay, this is a big brown bat.
Wow. Now, I have in my pile here a paper that you published a while ago. Are you expected to publish papers and reports?
You mean for this job? Yeah, we do annual summaries of our work, mainly to report back to our sources of funding. So if we get some federal funds, we're required to report back to the federal agencies that funded us to let them know what we've been working on,
Right.
what we've come to understand. There's certainly other opportunities to actually publish scientific findings. I work with a lot of local partners, various land trusts and research directors at various land trusts who
Right.
do have the capacity to do an experimental treatment. And then, I support that work, and then that can lead to publications down the road. But it's
Right.
not my main, publications are no longer my main focus.
Well, it just sounds initially that you're just a very busy woman doing all this bat research
Bats
stuff.
need a lot of help.
Now, perfect segue here is what are some of the challenges that bats face
Yeah.
in Connecticut?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most likely, most people at this point have heard of what's called white nose syndrome.
Right.
This is a disease that is caused by a fungus, and this fungus was accidentally introduced from Europe. It's spread across, it's pretty widely distributed. We discovered after it showed up here, we went back to Europe, or not we specifically, but researchers
Somebody did.
started noticing that, the bats in Europe also have this kind of white fungal growth, but they don't seem to be affected by it in the same way that our bats, who are naive to this
Right,
fungus,
right.
are. So what happened when it showed up back in 2006, 2007 in New York, and then within a year it was here in Connecticut, so it spreads very fast.
Yeah.
Is that the bats become very irritated by this fungus during hibernation, which is a very important part of their life cycle. They need to be able to maintain their fat reserves that they've built up over the fall and the previous summer. all the way through until it gets warm enough and there's insects back on the landscape that
Right.
they can eat. In the wintertime, there's no insects for them to eat. And so what happens is the fungus wakes them up very frequently. And even the process of just coming out of hibernation,
Right.
just raising their body temperatures, that's a very energy expensive process. So they end up burning through their fat reserves very quickly, and then they don't survive the winter.
So they go out maybe mid-February and there's nothing to eat.
Yeah, there's nothing to eat. They're very emaciated, they're very dehydrated, and then they
Yeah.
just succumb to starvation typically.
Let's talk about capturing bats.
Okay.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so we use, there's kind of a couple different approaches, but the idea is that you put something in a bat's flight of path, the bat encounters it, and the bat, with something such as mist nets, which are a very fine mesh netting that you just string along between two poles across maybe a roadway.
Yeah.
Or a trail within a forest. Bats like to use these kind of commuter rails. Bat commuter rails you can think of as a trail in a forest being
Right,
kind of a
right,
pathway
right.
that the bats can use.
A ready-made pathway.
Ready-made pathway. Waterways, also the same thing. Bats have to come and hydrate. A lot of species like to forage over water where there's emerging aquatic insects. And so
Right.
you kind of have ideas of where you're likely to encounter bats. So you basically just intersect the bat on its flight path. It gets kind of tangled in this net. It doesn't cause any harm to the bat. We remove them, monitor them frequently, get them out, process them, collect whatever samples we need to, whatever measurements we want to take, and then we let them go.
Let them go. Now, I'm wondering, in our previous conversations, you've indicated that their echolocation is state-of-the-art, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering why they can't see or hear the mist net. Are they just going too fast?
That's the idea, is that it's such a fine mesh. I don't even know if I can give you each little strand of the net is less than a millimeter. And the way echolocation works
Right.
is that the bats emit sounds at a frequency where those waves are going to be able to bounce off the surface of an insect.
Right.
Now, there's typically not going for insects that are smaller than a millimeter.
Right.
So their calls aren't really designed to capture such a small surface.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so it just kind of, the high frequency wavelengths will pass through the net and they won't really see it. Now, sometimes the bats do actually physically see the net and can learn to avoid it. And
Yeah.
that's frustrating when it happens. The bats outsmart us.
I
Happens
bet,
frequently.
yeah.
But typically they can't really see that net until it's a little too late in their
Now, do we weigh the bats when we catch them?
Yeah. With typical measurements you want to take, some of which are helpful for us to actually identify the species. So some bat species are really hard to tell even when you have them side by side in hand.
Right.
It can be difficult, especially with some of our what we call myotis species. And so you use measurements sometimes to delineate and make those determinations. So we measure their forearm quite often. We'll measure their ear length and what's called the tragus, which is this little part of your ear here.
Right.
They tend to have a really long one, but those can vary by species. We take their weights. We identify whether they're male or female, whether they're an adult or a juvenile, and then typically, depending on what time of the season you're capturing them, what stage of pregnancy they are if they're females. So
Wow.
if they're non-reproductive, or they're pregnant, or they're lactating, or they're post-lactating, you can kind of tell all those stages.
So I'm glad you brought up lactating. I was in my research. I was reading how bats they have their baby, and does the baby have to be born on a flat surface, or does it automatically grab onto something and hang there?
You know, I've never been there for a bat's birth. There are people who have. I'm not exactly sure. I've never witnessed a bat pup being born.
Yeah.
But I think nature would dictate, since they are kind of hanging up on vertical surfaces,
yeah.
that the baby probably pretty quickly can latch onto the mom at that point. So sometimes the females will fly with their baby. The baby can hold on and mom will fly and move the baby around when they're small enough to still
Yeah.
be moved that way. But I think that the pups learn pretty quickly. You know, it's like a horse. It's born and within 5 minutes it's walking. So the bats are just like, all they have to do is just kind of hang
Right.
there.
Now, I have a question about hanging on. In a little while, we're going to show the bat cam.
Mm-hmm.
And these are bats that are living in a barn up in Litchfield County.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand how they could grab onto a wood, a beam or something, and their little claws would fit into that.
Mm-hmm.
But when they go hibernate in a cave, they're not going to penetrate the surface of a rock. Do they just kind of like hang on there?
They do. They do. It's the same. You know, a rocky surface is very porous, even though it seems like it wouldn't be flat and like amenable to something hanging on. But the bat's claws are just so teeny they can fit into just little crevices. They also have this really cool tendon in their hind feet that basically once they're straight, it kind of locks into place. So the bat really doesn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about hanging. It just kind of happens physiologically because that tendon locks into place and holds it there. Which is why sometimes you will encounter a bat that has expired, unfortunately, but is still on the side of a wall or something.
Well, I guess if you have 50 million years to adapt, you get all the bells and whistles eventually.
Sure, absolutely.
Now, what about how many different bat species do we have?
In here in Connecticut?
Excuse me, in Connecticut.
In Connecticut, so officially we have 9 species that have historically occurred here. One of these is one of our 2 federally endangered species. It's called the Indiana bat, or Myotis sedalis. Some people might be more familiar with that. This species has really very rarely been detected in the state, and not really since the 1930s, other than one sighting.
Right.
So from my day-to-day job, like when I'm going through and vetting my acoustic data and taking a look, I don't really even think of that species as being here, because they just haven't shown any signs of recovery in this area, and they don't have a strong historical record. So we have 8 core species, and then we also have the potential and historical records of this 9th species, the Indiana bat.
Okay, now, so let's say 8 species. During migration, when they're getting ready to hibernate, I know here in Connecticut with birds, when we're going through that phase, or when they're migrating, we get a lot of different varieties of birds coming through. Do we have different bats flying through the area, or is it pretty much just the 8 or 9?
Yeah, it's just the 8 or 9. We don't get, basically there's no like migratory vagrant, like no migratory species that only pass through during that period.
Oh, okay.
Our migratory species, there's 3 of them. We call those tree bats, and then we call our hibernating species cave bats. So the 3 tree species of bats that do actually migrate long distances in the winter, they're still year-round residents within Connecticut. So we'll pick them up throughout the year. It just might be, and even including in wintertime, we're discovering more and more that they're kind of sticking around a little bit longer than we expected.
Now, what do you mean you find them? Are they dead on the road, or you just, are they
in some
your mist
cases,
nets?
No, we don't do any mist netting in the wintertime typically. So some people will have them in their house. I had one woman who had a silver-haired bat hanging out in her wood pile in late December, and then found him again, the same animal, in January. So this animal, obviously, we typically think of them as migratory.
Right.
But they're sticking around.
He's
in the
hanging
wintertime
around
as well. So
I guess it was helpful that last winter was extremely easy here in Connecticut.
Yeah, and I think that we're just kind of, like I said, there's still so much to learn about bats, and we're still kind of putting all these pieces together. How are they going to respond to these changes in weather patterns and climate? We don't know the answer to that, but, you know.
Let's talk about echolocation.
Okay.
Because that is fascinating, and we've heard about sonar echolocation in dolphins for a long time, and it's easy for me to visualize that, yes, the dolphin can find a quarter at the bottom of the tank, but for some reason I just can't grasp bats flying through the forest canopy, not hitting anything, not getting injured, and just carrying on. It's do you ever find any of them with smashed faces?
You know, I don't think that it probably doesn't happen too often that a bat, I've seen them in situations where I would have expected that they would have collided with me because I was standing in the entrance of a cave with 3 million bats flying around my head, and I'm not normally there.
One could expect that.
I would have expected at least one of them would have hit me, but not a single one did.
God.
They're just fascinating at what they do. If you think about it, they're catching insects that are flying that are a couple millimeters in length on the fly in the dark. So they're flying around, they think they hear an insect, they start to go towards it, the rate of their vocalizations gets faster and faster so that they're really like able to capture that space.
Right.
And then they close in on the insect, they'll scoop it up with their tail, and they'll eat it while they're flying. I mean, they're just fascinating.
Now they don't bite it out of the air, they hit it with their tail?
They kind of do both. So they go after it with their mouth, but then they'll use their tail to kind of.
Oh, okay.
It's almost like, you know, if you like were to bite something and then use your hands to kind of push it, secure the deal, right?
Right.
Seal the deal.
So this is what a bat detector looks like.
That is a very old.
It's a very
bat
old one,
detector.
but,
Yes, but it's
thank
still
you.
good. Oldie but goodie.
Yeah. So I'm going to go home tonight. On my way home, I'm going to get a new battery for it, and I will report back to you
Great.
what I find.
Absolutely.
Because like I said, you find them just as the sun is setting and dusk is eroding away, and then it's too dark to see them anymore.
Yeah, but they're there. They're out and
you
about.
know they're out there.
Yep. Those things are really fun. They also make, and I don't have one with me, unfortunately, to show everybody, but a company called Wildlife Acoustics does make a small unit that can be plugged into your phone. However,
Of course.
unfortunately, iPhones are no longer compatible with the new units. They only make them for Androids, but you
Yeah.
can plug it into your phone and kind of download this free app, and you can actually get species IDs from this cool little thing. And those types of, I'm not putting in a plug for any one company or another. I'm just saying that's the company that happens to produce this unit. But I think as interest in this grows, that those types of commercial opportunities to eavesdrop on bats. will
Well,
increase.
just in a related topic, I was down in Georgia a couple of months ago visiting my brother. I had to go down and visit the grandchild, and excuse me, and I went outside as dusk was setting, and I looked at the bats flying around. And of course, I didn't know what kind they were, but they were bats. And I went into my sister-in-law, and they said, "Well, what were you doing out there?" And I said, "Well, I was just looking at the bats." And my sister-in-law was just, I wouldn't say frightened, but she was taken aback that they have bats out there.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't want bats in my yard. And I said, you've had bats out there in your yard since you moved in 30 years ago.
And
Don't worry about it.
In fact, the bats were probably there before you.
I
the
would
same
say
bats.
that's true, yeah. So let's, so the echolocation, we talked about that. I just think it's fascinating that, they don't hit anything.
Yeah, it's one of the great, that you talked about how evolution really does fine-tune species to be able to survive, and it's just amazing. Different, and that's why the acoustics is so cool, because different species, again, because they're going after different prey types. So some species really specialize on beetles, some species really specialize on moths, some species really specialize on larger moths versus smaller moths, and so the frequency of their calls and kind of the structure and the characteristic of their calls has really evolved around that prey type that they're selecting for. So different species have kind of different diagnostic features to their calls, and that's how we're able to go and say, this is a big brown bat, this call came from a little brown, this call came from an eastern small-footed. And so it's really quite cool, and that's how specialized it is.
So if they're cruising along and they see a moth and they're looking for a bigger moth, do they pass on the little moth, or do they just grab him along the way?
I think, they're not like precluded from eating other prey types, and usually any sort of study that has looked at bat guano and the diversity, I did one myself using molecular techniques to look at what they're eating from their feces. Bats tend to have a very high variety of insect choices in their diet.
Wow.
Even if they're specialists on beetles, you'll still see, other forms, other types of insects in their diet. So they're specialists to some extent, but they're also opportunists. And some species are more generalist than others. Some species are very specialized. So there's over 1,400 different types of bats out on this great big planet of ours, so they have a lot of different opportunities.
That's a big number.
It is a big number.
Of different species.
1,400 and counting, so they're the second most diverse group of mammals on the planet.
Wow.
Rodents are number one.
Oh yeah, rats are everywhere.
They are.
We're gonna, I don't have the computer ready, so let's go to the video. And if we can get the computer ready, Max, that would be great. Can we do that? Oh, we do that
Oh,
video.
there's the footage. Perfect.
Now, tell us about this, Devon.
Okay, so we're so super excited about this. This is our Bats Count Bat Cam. This is
Yep.
just some sample footage that we captured the other day. We installed 4 cameras so we can actually spy on these little creatures while they're just hanging out in this barn that is
Yep.
at the White Memorial Conservation Center in Litchfield, Connecticut. This is a colony that has been using what we call the Green Barn for many decades. And these are pretty much all female bats that return to this barn year after year after year and have their babies, raise their babies. And
Now, just female bats.
for the most part, that's not to say that males don't also use this, but it's called a maternity colony. So typically
Okay.
the way social bats reproduce is the females all get together in a single location and they return year after year, and their daughters return to that same location and their daughters after them. So it's kind of, you get these kind of maternally linked colonies of bats on the landscape, and they've been using these structures for decades, if not longer.
Yeah. All right, so could we cut to the video, the big long break video?
We're helping plant a pollinator garden in Ridgefield for the pollinator pathway.
So what's going on today is that throughout Ridgefield we're installing a connected set of pollinator gardens to promote the education of our community about pollinators and the importance of insects in general.
The Ridgefield Pollinator Pathway and neighboring towns' Pollinator Pathway is such a great example of community engagement around pollinators. Connecting habitat patches in a concerted way is, I think, one of the best ways to think about pollinators on the scale that they are using the landscape. So bumblebees are traveling something like 3 miles to get different resources for their nest. They're trying to get the perfect balance of protein to lipid content. Sometimes that means they're going up and down looking for the right plants to balance that content for their offspring. So the more pollinator resources you have in a connected way is great for pollinators. You're creating a messy lawn, but you want to advertise to others that this is something you're doing deliberately, is to put up a habitat sign.
Well, we got some volunteers here to plant our first pollinator pilot garden, and we pulled out the mugwort, and now we are planting.
We've got our pretty darn quick seed mix from Prairie Moon with the wetland enhancement. Well, there's a wide variety of items, and we have purple cone flower, there's cardinal flower, we have different clovers, right? Clovers, we have goldenrods.
I went to a talk that said the perfect way to start a pollinator garden is 3-3-3. You do 3 plants that bloom in the spring early for like the first pollinators that need nectar. Then you do 3 that are over the summer, and you do 3 that are fall. And then you can add and should add some host plants like the milkweed that the caterpillars use.
Tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and I'm going to become part of the pollinator pathway.
Okay, so that was a clip from a previous show about pollinator pathways. And the reason I chose that was because if you promote pollinator pathways, in a way you're promoting native insects, which are the primary food for bats.
Yeah, exactly. So anything that you're doing to promote other species that are in some level of imperilment right now, such as our pollinators, is going to provide habitat for foraging bats because you're providing habitat for insects.
Right.
It's also not unrelated to bats because many species of bats are actually pollinators, very important pollinators themselves.
Right.
So I don't know if anybody in the audience enjoys the occasional sip of tequila, but agave, which is the plant that produces tequila, is bats are the primary pollinator for it. So you have bats to thank for your margaritas.
I was, as you were getting ready to say that, I was going to mention that. So.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to scoop you.
That's okay.
It's a fun
So
fact.
that was the pollinator pathway, basically food source for bats.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Just, I often get the question, what are good ways to promote bats in the area?
Yeah.
We have a bat house. We can talk about that momentarily.
Oh,
but
what a perfect segue.
look at those segues. They're just coming
Let's
together.
do that. So,
But creating habitat for pollinators is going to do the same thing and benefit bats as well.
right.
This is another option
So
for attracting bats.
Here is a bat house, and why is it all black?
Yeah, so bats like it really warm when they're roosting and trying to, incubate their babies and then have their babies and keep their babies warm. So generally black is a good color because it's going to absorb the heat as opposed to reflecting it. But you also want to have a longer bat house can be a lot better for bats because it gives them the opportunity to kind of move up and down to get different kind of temperature regimes along the way. So they can go down lower if it's a real hot day, or they can go up higher and snuggle up at the top if it's a real cool day.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And this is pretty heavy, but it doesn't seem like it's terribly difficult to make.
No, actually we had I think an Eagle Scout. This predates my time with the department, but this was the contribution by an Eagle Scout for his project. I'm not exactly sure how the Eagle Scout thing works, but they have a project, and his was to build us a bunch of bat houses. So these are excellent versions of a bat house, and it was literally just made from, bits of plywood and some screws. And we have instructions for how to do this on the bat program website for DEEP. So.
Okay. So doesn't seem like it's very difficult to make. It is kind of heavy. Where would you put this?
Yeah, so there's been, several studies have tried to explore what the optimal positioning of a bat house is, and I kind of just remember it as side of a building is better than a pole, is better than a tree. But all three are options.
Yeah.
The main thing you want to do is make sure that you're positioning it or orienting the bat house so that it faces it gets a full day of sun. So really, they want that morning sun all the way through, and then afternoon sun is really quite critical. So southward.
It's nice and warm inside.
Yeah. You don't want it in a really shady place, which is why trees are not often the best location. Trees also provide kind of perch points and, access to predators that might want to, crawl up and reach in and grab themselves a little baby
and do some bad things to the bats.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the bat house. And the plans for the bat house are available on your website.
Yeah.
I must apologize, I kind of screwed up. I didn't have my computer ready so we could go and visit it. But if you go to Batcamp.
Yes, there are a couple there's two different ways to stream. Perfect, look at that.
Okay.
There's two different ways to stream our website. One is through the White Memorial Conservation Center's website. The other is through the DEEP website. The URLs to get there are more complicated than I can remember, although I think we might be able to display them later. But the best thing to do is just go to your Google search bar and do bats count Batcam, and that'll bring the top two choices you'll get are both ways that you can stream this. And so what this is, as I said, there's 4 different cameras. One is positioned at the exterior of the building.
Right.
And this is a way people can help contribute.
That's what we see now.
Yeah, and this is just example footage, and I think you'll start to see bats flying just across the screen as they exit the tip of the very apex of the barn there, and they fly across the screen. So this is a way that we can all participate in counting bats. I recommend getting some of these cool little clickers, and we are asking as many of the public to participate in this as possible, which it just helps us get data that, I don't have every night to spend counting the bats, but if one person on one night has time to do it and another person on another night, and we get a really good number of contributions to these, and people take their time to do a bat emergence count, that helps us really narrow in and get really accurate counts of this population, because there can be a lot of noise and variation from night to night.
What predators do they face?
Yeah, so any sort of aerial predator can certainly go after a bat. If anybody has ever visited, Austin has a very famous bat colony that comes out of
I'd like to go there someday.
You should. It's really amazing. The free-tailed, those are called Mexican free-tailed bats, and they come out in this massive column of bats. It extends for miles.
Yeah.
And they just come out for like a full hour and a half. It's just a column of bats. But the hawks have learned, oh, hey, it's coming up on 7 o'clock, the bats
Yeah.
are coming out. So they'll
Snack time.
they'll just kind of fly through this cloud of bats and pick themselves off one or so in the way. There's also some, I went to Puerto Rico once for a bat conference, which was a really cool conference to go to. And there's a population of boa constrictor that have specialized or evolved specifically to hang on the side of this cave entrance that's like a vertical shaft cave.
Yeah.
And as the bats fly out, they just grab themselves a quick bat. So it's a little savage, but it is really cool from an evolutionary perspective.
That's the way it is. That's the way it goes.
Yeah.
So back to the bat house. Would you say there's a housing shortage?
So again, returning to the conversation of white nose syndrome, and I didn't really get to specific numbers, but we lost upwards of 90% of our white nose affected species in Connecticut, if not closer to 100% for some species.
Yeah.
And so I would say currently roosting locations and habitat is not the limiting factor. It's still, the biggest pressure continues to be either foraging habitat loss or the disease itself persisting and continuously killing bats during the winter. So no, we don't have a shortage, but I think the more bat houses we can put out, the more that we can provide support for all features and events in a bat's life is just going to help the population. Because bats reproduce so slowly, right? One female has one pup per year. And so they kind of break all the rules of being small mammals, right? They're very long-lived. Bats can live upwards of 30 years and maybe even more for a little animal. That's pretty spectacular. And then they also reproduce very slowly. So no matter what, recovery is going to be very slow. And so anything that you can do to support them, and also by providing bat houses, bats will use human structures such as attics, and a lot of people don't want bats in their attics, which is understandable. The bats really aren't causing too much harm. But if you provide them with an alternate, then maybe they're less inclined to use that attic space that you don't want them in. So that can be a really effective tool to help encourage the bats outside of the home, but still in your yard, so they're still helping you out with those insects.
Now, I on a kind of a related issue, I put up a barred owl house 2 years ago now, 2 breeding seasons now, and no barred owl has moved in. If I put up a bat house, are they likely to move right in, or hard to say?
It's really hard to say, and it can be totally hit or miss. Again, in some areas there might be more of a shortage. So, bats are like anything; they can cluster in the landscape. They're not completely evenly distributed across Connecticut. There's patches where there's a lot of bats, and there's patches where there's fewer bats. And so don't be discouraged if your bat house doesn't get colonized in the first year. It might not happen. But give it a couple seasons, and if by maybe the 3rd or 4th year it's still not getting colonized, then maybe you want to move it to a new location.
Move it.
But you also want to make sure that the bats, that there are a substantial number of bats in your area. So your acoustic detector, your new toy, might work to help you determine if there's a lot of bat activity.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
That'll be great.
So.
Now, let's talk about Bat Appreciation Day.
Hey.
And I've never heard of that.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know what your advertising budget is, but
we should work on it.
It probably needs to be a little bigger.
Well, I definitely recommend that everybody follow the Connecticut Fish and Wildlife page on Facebook if you're on social media, or our Instagram, any sort of social media. We do have an account, and we do kind of advertise these types of events. So we had a really cool bat cam ribbon cutting ceremony back in June, and that's really kind of how we advertise that. But Bat Day has been happening for, I think since 2018 was the first one, which still precedes my time. I've only been with the division for about 2.5 years. But every, around September, we partner with the old Newgate copper mine, the old Newgate Prison copper mine.
Right.
And they open up the facilities for people, and we have a bunch of stations and stands and various people that are bat experts in their own right. We have some rehabbers come who are amazing, and typically they'll have one of their rehab animals that's not releasable into the wild, and so it's used as an educational animal.
Oh, wow.
So it is an opportunity to see an actual
Why
bat.
would it not be able to be released?
Well, sometimes they have an injury that precludes them from being released. Sometimes pups are orphaned. Usually they they do get released. That is the main goal of rehab, is
Right.
to come help the animal through this particularly challenging time of its life with an injury or whatever, or orphaned, and then release them out into the wild. Every once in a while, it's just not possible.
Now, Bat Appreciation Day
Oh, yeah.
this year at the old Newgate Prison in East Granby is going to be September 17th.
Yes.
I unfortunately will not be in the state.
Shame.
I'll be vacationing because I would really like to go.
Well, we have it every year, so next year you can just plan around Bat Day.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so what happens at Bat Day?
Yeah, so we make it free. The people who manage, the people who manage Old Newgate Prison
Yep.
use this as an opportunity, and this year it definitely coincides with what their normal free day is anyway. But it's an opportunity for people to come in without charge, see the bats. They can take a tour of the mine that the bats use for hibernation, and that's the reason that we use this. Is there's this underground mine that I think is I think Old Newgate is the first prison in New England. If I'm
you're
stating
right.
that correctly.
I think you're right, yeah.
Historically, it's got a really cool history and a cool story there. Just, in spite of the bats, it's just a cool place to visit.
Yeah.
But you get to go into this mine where these prisoners were kind of forced to live underground in these really crazy conditions. So you can kind of just get a sense for the magnitude of that.
Crazy equals horrid, I bet.
Yeah, it's damp down there, but
Yeah.
it's nice and cool in the summertime. So if it's a hot September, it's a great little escape from the heat.
Right.
So from 10 to 3, people can come in and they go at designated tour times, and then there's all sorts of other activities. And what they do is in the winter time, they actually close the mine to public entry so that the bats can go in and be undisturbed during winter. And this
Right.
is something that they agreed to, and it's just an amazing partnership that we're all kind of working together as a community for the well-being of bats.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, for the people watching this program, what do you need them to do, or what would you like them to consider?
Yeah, I personally think that all wildlife should be acknowledged for the value that it provides.
Right.
We talk about something as scientists and biologists of ecosystem services. And this just means that these are things that animals are doing in their day-to-day business that they would be doing anyway that in some way benefits humans.
Right.
It's a notoriously difficult thing to quantify, and so it often doesn't really win out against competitive economic models. But the more we do, like when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, very
Right.
rarely does the value, but there's been some really interesting studies coming out post-White Nose about the value of insectivorous bats and how they contribute to insect control in agricultural systems and save farmers billions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars just in the US. And those
Right.
costs get passed down to consumers. So that would be something I would keep in mind for everybody, is just that, even the creepy crawly things that you don't like, they still have a function.
Right.
And even if you don't think you're benefiting from them, just their very existence is beneficial to us in ways that we wouldn't be able to replace if we lose them. And bats definitely fit that role. I mean, they're pollinating, I mentioned tequila, so that's a huge industry and a huge moneymaker for a lot of people.
Yes.
And a huge pastime for a lot of other people.
And tequila doesn't get made without the bats.
It doesn't get made without the bats. There's just so many services that bats are providing that we can't quantify. And I guess if I had one wish that I could snap my fingers or rub a magic lamp and have my wish granted, it would be that everybody in the world could see bats through my eyes.
Right.
How much I love these animals, and they're just fascinating and beneficial for just 1 minute. And I think that would change a lot of people's minds, because I absolutely love them. But not everybody does, and that's reasonable. I understand.
Right.
But just to encourage yourself, or try and push yourself beyond that kind of innate fear for a moment,
Right.
and just appreciate these animals for what they do. The Bat Cam, I think, will really help with that. We get this
Yeah.
opportunity to see these animals be really good moms. They're nursing their pups, they're communicating, they're socializing.
I have a story I'd like to share with you. And since we started going back and forth preparing for this program, I've been going to the Bat Cam regularly.
Good.
And I went to the Bat Cam on July 13th.
Mm-hmm.
And down here on the shore, it was a very nice day. It was mild, it was a little cloudy. But up in the Northwest Hills, up at Litchfield, there was a horrific thunderstorm going on. And I kid you not, I went to the bat cam, and there was a lightning flash every 5 or 6 seconds. And there was horrendous rain, big streaks, and I didn't know if that was rain or maybe hail, but these bats were out there flying around in the middle of this storm, and I had always assumed that when bad weather came, they went into their roost and they waited it out, but no.
Yeah.
No, these bats were out in the storm doing what they always do, zip up, zip back, and I gotta tell you, I was just astounded.
They're tough little animals. I mean, they are tough. I'll tell you what.
I was just astounded that they were out in the middle of this horrific thunderstorm.
Yeah.
And they were just doing what they normally do.
I mean, I'll tell you what, that even surprises me a little bit. I have definitely, when I was doing my graduate work, I put radio transmitters on bats and would follow them around while they foraged.
Yeah.
And I did have one animal that came out in a pretty heavy rainstorm, and then the lightning started, and since we're standing up with these telemetry rods that are giant metal conductors, I said, we're calling it for the night.
Give it to the intern.
But she did. She went out and foraged. But that's an example of what I mean, is we get to still learn these things about bats, you know, that we wouldn't have that information and that knowledge that that's what they're doing without these cameras. So we're really excited about that.
Right. So if we could, just look at this poster for a little bit. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but in this picture over here, there is a radio telemetry transmitter. Is that what we call it? Transmitter?
Little radio transmitter.
And how far away can they go before you lose contact with them?
Ooh, that's a great question. So these are incredibly small transmitters.
Yeah.
They have to be less than 5% of the bat's body weight, and for a bat that weighs less than 20 grams,
that's not much.
Not a lot. So these things weigh less than a gram themselves typically. So they don't have a huge range, and it really, telemetry, anybody who's ever done telemetry will tell you, it depends on the landscape. If there's a lot of topography and the bat goes behind something, you're not going to hear it.
You're not going to hear it.
Or if it dips down into the forest canopy, that the signal isn't really that strong. But you can get in a clear line of sight a couple miles.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very good. So we have a couple of different pictures here. Oh, and here's a truck with your sonic.
That has a nice painted version of this on there.
What do we call it? Sonic listener?
Ultrasonic detector. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that nice word.
Ultrasonic.
So here we have an ultrasonic detector, and again, it's just amazing that that you are using the technology to better understand these animals.
It's very fun. We do get to eavesdrop on bats. Now, our mobile transect program is a very much volunteer-driven program, so we're so grateful to many volunteers that we've had over the years and across the state doing these 12 routes for us twice per month for 5 months out of the year. So it's a lot of work, and we get volunteers to contribute to that, and we're just really grateful for that. We've gotten a lot of really cool insights and data from these surveys. This poster just kind of highlights all of the strategies that we're taking to protect bats in this post-white nose world. So there's a picture of a gate that was put up over a vertical mine shaft at Roxbury Mine Hill Preserve in Roxbury.
And they could easily fly through.
So the bats can get in and out of it, but humans can't. So the bats are really protected during winter when they're the most vulnerable. Right.
Now, before we close for this evening, I want to talk about pesticides. I myself don't use pesticides or anything on my property, and I think it's a big problem that there's so much pesticides out there. And I have a personal friend, and you know, it's hard to get on your soapbox with your friends, with your inner circle, Roundup came up, and I said, you know, I tried to say, you know, this is really not good. And what he said was, well, I only use a gallon a year. And then I think, you know, well, there's probably 10,000 people in Connecticut or, you know, along both coasts of Long Island Sound that are saying, I only use a gallon a year. And it's just an awful material.
Yeah.
And I have to believe if a bat eats a bug with pesticide on it, it's at least going to get sick and will probably die.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's actually what I spent a lot of my time in grad school trying to understand. It's a very difficult question to answer. What I can say is that they're continuing to find DDT and different derivatives in the tissue of bats even to this day. So
Wow.
pesticides that have been banned for 40 plus years
Yes, yeah.
are still showing up accumulated in the fat tissue.
That's awesome.
What replaced, awesomely terrifying.
Yeah, well,
It's amazing.
awesome
but-
in a bad way.
So, and then for subsequent pesticides that replace the DDTs, we call them organophosphates. So the DDTs were the organochlorines, and then the organophosphates kind of came as a solution to that
Yeah,
problem.
yeah.
There have been exposure experiments with bats in the past, and what they did find is that bats don't necessarily succumb to death as quickly, but even at low doses, their flight abilities get compromised, which for an
I would
animal.
think, something would affect them.
Sure. And then you also think there's kind of two ways that pesticides are impacting bats, right? First, you have the direct exposure, so they're consuming insects that are dusted with these chemicals.
Right.
And then they're also, the target of these chemicals is to reduce the natural prey source for these animals. So you're simultaneously limiting their food availability and making the food that is available to them toxic.
Yeah.
So again, I understand that there's commercial value in pesticides and that our agricultural systems rely on them, but I think just as with everything, there's responsible ways to do it. And we can just continue to research these and figure out what better ways that we can do integrated pest management systems.
I think it's imperative that we figure something out.
Yeah, I agree.
This is just, and we talked about pesticides in the pollinator pathway show. You don't need them in your flower garden.
Well, yeah, and we're consuming them ourselves,
Yeah.
There's residues that we're consuming. And
Let's not go down that road.
Yeah, it's all part of it, though. We're connected to everything on this planet.
Just before we go, I have a little story. We have 2 garter snakes in my flower bed, and much to my wife's chagrin. But I kind of think that I have garter snakes in my garden because I don't use any pesticides, and they didn't get sick eating any bugs in my yard. So I think it's a good sign that maybe we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think the more holistic and healthy you create an entire environment, the more biodiversity you're going to welcome into that environment.
So we're almost done, and I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Likewise, thank you.
I'm just so grateful that you were here to talk about this subject, and I'm glad that the Connecticut DEP pays you to do this work.
Me too.
Clearly, it's extremely important.
It is.
Extremely important work, and I thank you for doing that.
Thank you, and thank you for raising awareness and bringing this conversation to your audience.
I would close by saying, think very carefully about your use of pesticides. Because especially here on the shoreline, it kills your bugs and it kills your weeds, but it keeps going into the water table and it keeps killing. And so one of my plans for the future is to have some kind of water table expert at DEP come and talk about this to actually say, yes, what Jim is saying is true. But anyway, so thank you. Thank you for watching. And if you have any questions or if you want to go to the BatCam, it's Bats Count BatCam. And there's actually 4 views there. And I like the one with the sky in the background. So that's it for now. Thank you and have a good night.